Hey, what's up everybody? This is Steve from Harvard Marketing Agency, and in this video, I want to dive into how marketing has changed from pre-pandemic and pre-iOS updates to 2023, today's world, where we're past the pandemic and the dust has settled from the Apple updates a little bit. So the first thing I'm going to do in this video is really dive into a breakdown of the history and sequence of events that led us to where we are today. And the way I look at this is there's kind of three phases to this. The first is pre-pandemic and pre-Apple updates. So that's going to be 2017, 2018, 2019. Then there's the pandemic period where everyone was in quarantine and the Apple update was coming out in early 2021. So that's kind of the middle territory where things were a little bit muddy and nobody really knew what was going on. And then there's the post-pandemic, post-Apple update period, which we're in right now, which is 2022 and 2023. So the first phase that we're going to talk about here is that 2017, 2018, 2019 pre-pandemic and pre-Apple update era. And in this period of time, Facebook was still kind of in its heyday. It was still sort of in that golden era where D2C wasn't super competitive yet. There hadn't been the big pandemic push where everybody was trying to get their brand online. Ad costs were still relatively affordable. And the Apple update hadn't come out yet, so attribution, while it wasn't perfect, was better than what it is today. And so in these times, really the kind of D2C e-commerce playbook was find a really good media buyer who understood the Facebook ad platform very, very well. And as long as you had decent unit economics and, a decent funnel built, you could put up a product or a couple products that had a decent product market fit, and there's a reasonable chance that it would be successful. It was much easier to be an e-commerce success story in this time period. In addition to this, during this time period, investors were really pouring a lot of money into D2C e-commerce brands, and capital was easy to get. So it was relatively easy to start an e-commerce brand and be successful during this period of time. So the next period of time that we're going to talk about here is 2020 and 2021. In 2020, this was where the pandemic struck in March of 2020, and what ended up happening was that consumer demand really shifted from in-person retail locations to suddenly everybody wanting to buy things online. Everybody was quarantined and locked in their house for a couple months, and they really had just nothing to do except sit there and buy things online. And so brands had to adapt to this because the demand was no longer in their in-person retail locations, and they kind of had to scramble to get their online stores, ready to sell and launch ads on Facebook and, really just quickly adapt to meet consumer demand that had shifted to the online space. And so what ended up happening was there were more brands that were advertising on Facebook just due to the shifted consumer demand towards online shopping. And so ad costs went up a little bit, but the good news for these e-commerce and D2C brands was that consumer demand sort of outpaced the increase in ad costs. So for most e-commerce and D2C brands, as long as you had a decent product and pretty good unit economics, this was a very profitable time for most brands out there. And then fast forward to 2021, this is where the Apple update came out and things started to get a bit more challenging. So basically, Apple came out with this update and it blocked iPhones from being tracked by third-party pixels like the Facebook pixel. So this made attribution a lot more challenging, and it also meant that less data was being passed through to Facebook Ads Manager for it to optimize for its next purchase. So couple that with people, kind of going back to in-person shopping. Again, this is March of 2021. The pandemic is still going on, but it's not quite at the levels it was at during its peak. People aren't quarantining as much anymore, and things are starting to normalize at least a little bit. So that means that demand was shifting back from online back to retail a little bit. This made it very challenging for D2C e-commerce brands because they had suddenly, they had put all of these resources into building up their online presence, and now things were shifting back to retail a little bit. But they were still spending money on Facebook, which meant that ad costs were still relatively high. So this was a very challenging time. Ad costs were still competitive, demand wasn't quite there, and what we started to see was that customer acquisition costs went up quite a bit during this period. And so what we started to see was a lot of brands that maybe didn't have the best product market fit, or they didn't have really strong unit economics, or even they just didn't have enough cash in the bank to weather the storm of a period of higher customer acquisition costs. They started to not do so well. Some of them went out of business, and again, it was just a very challenging time. So that brings us to the current period, which is kind of the post-pandemic, post-Apple update period that we're in now, which I would say would be mid to late 2022 to current times in 2023. Now, the ways that things have shifted since that pandemic and, Apple update period is that while attribution is still muddy for most D2C e-commerce brands, there's now at least a playbook for it. So you'll see most e-commerce and D2C brands using some kind of post-purchase survey after checkout. There are tools like Triple Whale and Northbeam that will lend a little bit of insight into the customer journey and what channels are causing people to convert. You'll also see brands use things like media efficiency ratio and a blended CPA model to track the overall efficiency of their marketing, which is not channel by channel, but at least gives them some kind of guiding metric into the health of their marketing efforts. As far as ad costs go, you'll generally see that ad costs, while they're not quite as high as they were peak pandemic, they're still slightly higher than pre-pandemic, and there's a little bit less efficiency than there was pre-pandemic because, again, Facebook is not getting all that pixel data that it used to get. So you can still make it work, but it's a little bit more challenging now. You need to have a better product, and you need to have a really strong unit economics in order to achieve a meaningful level of scale here. And finally, I would say the big shift as a media buyer is that strategy has kind of shifted a little bit from really being inside the ad account and knowing the ad account inside and out and knowing what buttons to push, more so to just being a really good marketer and having really good creative and testing a lot of it. So this comes down to, really understanding your customer, understanding the psychology behind what makes them buy, and then crafting video and imagery and messaging that actually compels them to make a purchase instead of just relying on a really strong Facebook algorithm to find the right person at the right time who is going to buy no matter what type of ad or image or video you put in front of them. So now that we've covered the different phases of how e-commerce has evolved over the last 5 or 6 years or so, let's chat about how the day-to-day playbook of operating an e-commerce or D2C company has evolved at that time. So again, I think in 2019, 2018, 2017, you really could just rely on a really good media buyer to go into your ad account and, know what buttons to push and rely on the Facebook algorithm to find the right person at the right time who is just ready to convert no matter what type of ad creative you put in front of them. And I think one of the big shifts that has happened in that time is that, now creative is much, much more important. And it really is very, very important now to just be a good marketer and understand your customer and understand what type of creative is going to get them to convert and what drives them to purchase and what the emotional pain points and benefits they're seeing to your product are. And so because of that, you're seeing a lot of brands place a much larger emphasis on sourcing new photography on a more frequent basis, sourcing new video on a more frequent basis, testing out different variations of creative more frequently. So testing out UGC versus lifestyle images versus lifestyle videos versus, customer testimonials or customer unboxings or, text overlay ads or, different offers. You're just seeing a lot more creative testing happening because that's one of the big shifts that, really has taken place over the past couple of years that's going to make your ad account successful and allow you to scale your ad spend and therefore your sales. So that's kind of the first main shift that I think has happened here. I think the second change in the playbook that has occurred over the last couple of years is, again, it was just easier to be successful with paid advertising, during that initial start of the pandemic and pre-pandemic period. And now, I think things have shifted in that you can't just throw up an ad on Facebook and have a half decent funnel on the back end and expect it to work. Back in 2019, you could. Your website didn't have to be that good. Your email marketing backend didn't have to be that good. Your customer service didn't have to be that good. Customer acquisition was so cheap back then that you could just throw up an ad, acquire a customer, and scale that. Nowadays, brands need to pay much closer attention to not just testing new creative in the ad account, but also testing different landing pages, making sure that their site is converting the way that it needs to, making sure that they have a high email opt-in rate and they're nurturing those leads on the back end with a good email marketing flow. And really, looking at the funnel a bit more holistically and understanding how to make the whole thing work, as opposed to just saying, we're just going to run Facebook ads and hope that that works. So that's shift number 2 that I think most brands are starting to pay more attention to. The last shift here is I think brands are realizing that direct-to-consumer is a revenue channel, but not necessarily a business model. So in that pre-pandemic or initial pandemic period, again, you had a lot of brands that solely relied on direct-to-consumer and solely relied on just selling their products online, and they looked at that as their entire business model. And what we've seen over recent years as ad costs have gone up is that people have realized that they were entirely dependent on using Facebook to scale their business. And when ad costs went up, they were basically out of business for a lot of people. And so now brands are realizing that it's important to diversify. It's important to expand into retail. It's important to look at other revenue channels so that you're not placing all of your eggs in one basket with direct to consumer. I think they're also starting to realize that you need to own your traffic more. You can't just rely on, paying Facebook money and hoping that ad costs are cheap enough for them to drive a high enough volume of traffic to your site for it to convert and you to convert people at a reasonably profitable customer acquisition cost. You need to be collecting emails. You need to be building your text message marketing list. You need to own your traffic so that way, if ad costs do go up, you can weather the storm a little bit. So I think diversification is something that is more top of mind for brands nowadays than it was pre-pandemic. So I hope that helps and hope you got value out of this video. And if you're looking for a marketing agency to help you scale up your online sales, don't hesitate to reach out to us at harbormarketingagency.com. Go ahead, check out our website, book a call, and we'll see if we're a good fit to work together.